How many people in the audience here are actually in the transportation industry? Okay, we've got quite a few. Well, this is actually geared towards any industry. This presentation is basically going to focus on the mechanical contractor that might have 12 pickup trucks, or the medical waste company that might have a whole fleet of box trucks, or the cable contractor that might have 200 pickup trucks. And basically what we're going to cover is what you as an employer need to do to protect yourself with your commercial auto fleet exposure. So we'll jump right into what the objectives are with this presentation. Basically, we're going to cover why it's important for you to update your fleet safety program. How many people in here actually have a fleet safety program? Good deal of you, that's good. What we're going to cover and help you out with is some of the things that you could do to enhance that existing program. For those of you that didn't raise your hand, we'll just give you some ideas on what you can do to implement a program. Even if you have just one, let's say you have one shuttle bus, you're a skilled nursing facility and you've got a shuttle bus that takes residents to and from doctor's appointments or on shopping trips. You still should have some semblance of a fleet safety program to assist you and protect you in the event there is a motor vehicle accident. We'll talk a little bit about ANSI Z15.1. Safety geeks like myself like to throw a lot of acronyms out there, a lot of numbers out there, but that is a standard that can help you in enhancing your fleet safety program. We'll also talk about what should be included in a program, some of the basics that should be included. We'll talk about resources that are available to assist you. We'll talk about how you go about doing it. And basically at the end of this, we'll have some time for some answers, questions and answers as well. So why do you need to update your fleet safety program? And this is actually a political cartoon based on 2013 statistics, but traffic deaths had reached their highest level since 1990. And so you see the driver there saying, oh, really? Hold on, hold my coffee while I Google that to find out why, while they're driving. So in your daily commute to and from work, I'm sure you've seen some crazy things. People reading the paper, maybe shaving their face, texting, whatever it may be. Distracted driving is more than just the cell phone. And those statistics actually have increased since then. When it comes to deaths per year, 2,400 deaths a year are related to motor vehicle accidents. It's the second leading cause of fatalities in the workplace. That represents about 42% of the annual number of occupational fatalities, 39% contributing to alcohol. So if you have a drug-free workplace program, do you consider, alcohol and testing for alcohol? Annual cost about $60 billion with an average crash cost costing $16,500. So if we did the math on that, and I'm just doing this quickly off the top of my head, $16,500 annual average cost for a claim. So let's say you just have one motor vehicle accident per month, 12 per year. Not a lot, right? 12 per year is about $198,000 if you're looking at an average cost of $16,500. So $198,000 in cost, that's just direct costs. Let's say your organization has a 3% profit margin for whether you make widgets, collect blood, collect medical waste, whatever you may do. At a 3% profit margin with $198,000 in costs, your organization would have to do $6.6 million in additional revenue just to make up for the cost of those motor vehicle accidents. This here is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2014-2013 data. And again, it's showing you basically that the motor vehicle accidents contribute to about 40 to 42% of fatalities in the workplace. They are also the leading cause of lost work days in the workplace as well. And I know a lot of employers focus in on their DART rate or their total recordable incident rate. When it comes to insurance, we're kind of a necessary evil. I know a lot of people are, oh, here comes my loss control guy again. But when it comes to insurance, besides workers' compensation costs, guess what your second line of insurance costs you the most? Your commercial auto. So what we're going to talk about when it comes to a fleet safety program is why do we want to have one? Well, that first bullet point is a no-brainer. Duh, we want to make sure that we aren't having accidents. We want to prevent collisions from occurring. We can't afford to replace trucks left and right. And if you look at the cost of even a minor fender bender where it's minimal damage to a vehicle can cost you anywhere from $1,500 up. And then if the individual involved is claiming an injury, that's going to cost your organization even more. We want to protect our drivers. We want to make sure that they're being safe. The whole point of being here is all about safety. So if we're putting people behind the wheel to do work for us, we want to make sure that they're being safe regardless of whether they're in our physical location or if they're behind the wheel representing our organization. We also want to make sure that they have the proper equipment. If your organization's on a massive growth curve, you want to make sure that you're providing them with the proper equipment to get the job done. You look at like Amazon, for example, and now they've got that with the Amazon Prime promising delivery within 2 hours. Do they have the appropriate equipment to actually fulfill that promise to their customers? And then you also want to look at accountability. And as Charlie had said, as Carrie had said this morning as well, it all comes down to accountability. We want to make sure that our employees are being held accountable for their actions when they're representing our organization, when they're behind the wheel, that they're not killing somebody. So a lot of times I'll get asked the question, look, I'm just a mechanical contractor. Aren't all these fleet safety programs the same? Can't I just buy a program off the shelf and plug in the company name and here I have a fleet safety program? No, they're not all the same. And actually, they're a lot more different than they are the same, depending upon what types of vehicles you have, the size of your fleet, what type of people are you selecting to drive those vehicles? Are you just doing the warm body method and hiring people because you have to meet obligations as far as delivery of product or delivery of services? And it's really not one size fits all. I mentioned lots of different scenarios, a cable contractor with 200 pickup trucks, as opposed to a skilled nursing facility with one shuttle bus. They're not going to have the same components of a fleet safety program. There'll be some little nuances between the two, but they will have some basics as well built into it. So we'll get into some of those details. Really, what you need to do right now is stop and take a look at what do we have in place. If we don't have anything, where do we start? Do we look at the trends we've had? Do we work with our insurance guy and have him tell us what we need to do? Or do we stop and look at it and say, hey, you know what? Something's got to change because we've been doing this the same way for 20 years, and it's great when we started out with mom and pop and one vehicle, but now we've grown into a huge conglomerate and we've got 200 vehicles on the road, and we can't follow those informal policies and procedures that we've had in place for 20 years. So what you can do is a lot of times is look at what standards are out there. What do I have to start with? And one of the things that you have to start with is what we call a consensus standard, ANSI Z15, and the title of that is Safe Practices for Motor Vehicle Operations. And what a consensus standard is basically it's not a regulation or a compliance standard that you must comply with this, but it's more of best practices related. What ANSI stands for is the American National Standards Institute. A lot of times they will put together these consensus standards as just the best practices, and then depending upon how often they are followed, professional organizations such as OSHA, National Highway Traffic Safety Institute, etc., regulatory organizations may take those consensus standards and build them into a compliance standard. So with this particular consensus standard, it can be used by anybody, regardless of whether you're one vehicle, 200 vehicles, regardless of what industry you are. And it doesn't conflict with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration or Department of Transportation or anything like that. But it gives you sort of a complementary set of rules and regulations that you can implement within your organization to make sure that your employees are operating your vehicles appropriately, that they're following safety procedures, that they're not hurting themselves, they're not hurting other people, and that they're representing your organization fairly. So the standard is kind of broken down. I don't know, anybody familiar with the ANSI Z15 standard? Nobody is. Okay, good. First and foremost, it's not something that you can just Google it and pull it up for free. With a consensus standard, they actually sell them. So that particular standard costs $77 to buy, but it's a good start, but I'll also tell you where there's some free resources later in the presentation here. That's not to say you can't buy it. But it's broken down sort of with the legalese on the left-hand side of the standard, and on the right-hand side, it gives you more of the supplementary information, more of the layman's terms as far as the lawyers say this is what you need to do, this is how you do it in layman's terms. Some key areas that they cover. First and foremost, management policies. What's the one thing you need to have in any safety program in order for it to truly succeed? Top management commitment, exactly. So we'll cover, what do they mean by management policies? We'll cover what do they mean by the operational environment. When it comes to the operational environment, you have no control over weather conditions. You have no control over the other drivers that are out there on the road with your employees. But we'll cover what you can do to prepare your employees in dealing with that operational environment. We'll also cover driver issues. How do you go about selecting your drivers? Do you depend upon your insurance agent or your carrier to tell you what your selection criteria should be? Do you depend upon your agent or your carrier to pull the motor vehicle records? And what is acceptable as opposed to not acceptable? So we'll cover some of that as well. We'll talk about the vehicle issues as far as, what types of vehicles are you operating? How do you ensure that preventative maintenance is ongoing so that someone isn't out there driving a clunker and then a tire blows and they take out a school bus full of children and then you're on the news with negative PR and your business just goes boop, right down the drain? We'll also talk about incident reporting, making sure that you have some sort of accident reporting kit, some sort of accident reporting policy and procedure that your employees are aware of what to do in the event of an accident. How many of you have something, say, in the glove box of your company vehicles? Okay, good. We got a good in the back there. But a lot of times I bring that up and I get like deer in headlights look, like, well, they just call it into the office and then we handle it from there. That's great if they call it into the office, but somebody should be on the scene getting all the information, getting the witness statements, getting pictures and those sorts of things. So we'll go in a little more detail about that as well. But those are the key areas, the 5 key areas covered in that standard that at a minimum should be touched on in your existing fleet safety policies and procedures as well. Really, why do we want to do this? Yes, we want to mitigate our risk. Yes, we want to reduce costs. But again, it comes down to people. We want to protect people. We want to make sure our employees are safe. We want to make sure the general public's safe. We want to make sure that our employees go home the same way they came into work that day. It all ties in together, the same thing. So me being up here as the insurance guy, a lot of times, they just worry about the money. Yes, it's one concern, but it's not the only concern. So with the management policies and procedures, things you want to look at in your written program, what kind of training do you do? Do you do any kind of road test on the employee to make sure they can operate the equipment that you're expecting them to operate? Are you just taking it for granted to say, yeah, I drove tractor trailers 20 years ago, I know what I'm doing? Or yeah, I drove a stick back when I was learning in high school, I still know how to do it. You want to make sure that you're providing them with that sort of training. Do you take for granted that they know how to back a vehicle when it's pulling a trailer full of materials? Do you take for granted that they know how to secure the product that they're putting on those trailers? So you don't want to take it for granted and assume anything when it comes to training of your drivers. So you want to have some sort of training protocol built out into your fleet safety program. These are the types of trainings we expect you to have. Backing procedures, proper load securement, those kinds of things. Auditing. How often do you audit the vehicles to make sure that they are being properly maintained? If you've got a fleet of company vehicles that you're allowing the employees to take home, how are you keeping up with whether or not they're maintaining the vehicles as you expect them to? How often are you looking at the vehicles as far as housekeeping? That can be a concern as well. If they're basically living out of their vehicles during the workday, they might have the Mountain Dew containers and everything else in the cab of the truck. And then suddenly they go to hit their brake and that Mountain Dew can rolls right under the brake pad and they can't brake. So it's important that you're auditing and inspecting your vehicles as well. So you cover that in the program, written program. And then also looking at every accident that occurs. Was it preventable or not? And if it was preventable, what corrective action are you going to take to make sure that it doesn't happen again? More of a coach and learn process, and we'll get more into more detail on that. One of the key things to ask yourself when you're looking at all these different policies and procedures and the different topics that we cover, is it relevant or not? Because if you're a skilled nursing facility with one 15-passenger shuttle bus, it may not be relevant to have them go through a slew of 20 different training topics and you have to audit every week or those types of things. So if it's not relevant, if you don't have that exposure, eliminate that. But basically what we want you to understand is you need to at least ask yourself, what if? And if it's not there, but you think it should be there, why do we have the oversight? Is it something that we just added this type of vehicle to our fleet, that we didn't consider that? We didn't consider updating the fleet safety program once we added that vehicle? When it comes to the operational environment, you want to look at the driver themselves and the vehicle and how they interact. Does that driver know how to use air brakes? Do they have it? Are they required to have a CDL to operate the vehicle that you have? Don't take for granted that, it's just a box truck. It may be just a box truck, but there may be a requirement for a CDL license. So you need to consider that, and do the driver and the vehicle interact properly? Do they know how to operate it safely? Do they know where all the gears and gadgets and buttons are on that vehicle? Are we doing training in the yard before we put them out on I-4 or I-75 or wherever we put them out on the road? When it comes to routing and scheduling, how many in here have a dispatch where they're sending employees all over the place? We've got 1, 2, 3, we've got a couple there. Are there considerations on that as well? Like, I saw a lot of people from Bright House here, for example. I'm sure there's some consideration in how many jobs do we assign to one particular technician before we're overloading them, and there's no way they can possibly get from the north side of town to the south side of town, yet we're promising this 1-hour window for them to get there. So you need to think about your dispatching procedures and how you're scheduling things. You need to take into consideration congestion. By the time we get out of this conference today at 4 o'clock, what do we have to look forward to? A lot of traffic. Regardless of where we're going, we all have a lot of traffic to look forward to. Is that something that we take into consideration when we're scheduling for one of our employees to deliver a product and we give this tight window for them to operate in? Years ago, Domino's Pizza had that promise of half hour or less or the pizza's free. All of a sudden, their motor vehicle accidents went up like crazy. That's why you notice they don't do that anymore. Now they've got that high-tech DMX video, vehicle they've got now, whatever it is. That's nothing. But you want to look at how you're scheduling things and taking into consideration the weather. Do you have a policy in place? Let's say you have a box truck or a tractor trailer and you're scheduling drivers to go all over the state. Do you have a procedure as far as wind conditions? Let's say we have a hurricane. At what speed of wind conditions do we say, hey, we're pulling all of our drivers off the road? Those are things you need to think about. Other things you need to think about: personal use. Are you allowing your employees to use the vehicles for personal use? Do you have a written procedure on that? Are they allowed to let their 16-year-old kid that just got their learner's permit learn on that company vehicle? Those are things that should be in writing so that the employee can't say, you never told me. You never told me I couldn't do that. Weekend driving, after hours driving. If you have GPS or telematics on your vehicles, what are you using that system for? Is it simply just to see where the vehicle is? Or are you looking at when it's being used? Is it being used properly? Are you taking corrective action on it? And also, are you renting any vehicles? Do you have policies and procedures in place when it comes to rental vehicles? So there's a lot of considerations when it comes to fleet safety. You can't just say, well, we've got some basic rules written into our safety program about auto use. It has to go beyond that. So this standard kind of gives you the basic template of what you should have. Driver selection criteria. What is acceptable to your organization as far as a driver? Well, he's only had 1 DUI in the last 5 years. Let's hire him. Is that acceptable to you? Believe it or not, there are some employers out there that's okay. It happened 5 years ago. It'll never happen again. Cinco de Mayo's in 2 days. He's not going to go to the Mexican bar. Those are things you need to think about. Well, he's only had 2 speeding tickets, but he's close friends with the guy that owns Ticket Clinic, so we'll hire him. Looking at you, Marcus. So you need to think about those things. What criteria are you utilizing to select your drivers? Are you depending upon your insurance agent to say, hey, this guy can be a driver or he can't be a driver? Because they're not going to tell you why he or she cannot be a driver. They're just going to say yay or nay. So you as the employer should take some ownership of that. You should be the one pulling the motor vehicle records checks, not putting that upon your insurance agent or your insurance carrier, because with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, we cannot tell you why he or she cannot be a driver. We can simply say yay or nay, they can be a driver. Again, training. just because they say they've been a driver for 20 years or they've operated that vehicle in the past. Do a simple road test. Take them around the block of your facility. Have them demonstrate in the yard how to back up to a loading dock. Simple things that you can do that you can write into your policies and procedures to prevent physical damage, property damage, injuries. How often are you expecting these guys to drive? Do they know the rules and regulations when it comes to driving? If they're over-the-road drivers, tractor-trailer drivers, do they know the hours of service rules and regulations? Do they know when they're supposed to take their restart? Do they know when they're supposed to take their break? Tracy Morgan, the comedian, we all saw what happened there where he was on a comedy tour and the Walmart driver, driving longer hours than he should have. He was tired, fell asleep at the wheel, and ultimately that led to that accident that killed one comedian and injured Tracy Morgan pretty badly. So what are the expectations of your drivers? Do you outline what the expectation is? Do you tell them that they should be taking breaks? That should be in writing in your program as well. What corrective actions are you going to take? If your employee gets a speeding ticket, what are they required to do? Are they going to pay for the ticket? Or do you require them to go through a driver improvement class? Those are things that you need to think about as well. Or if they get in a preventable automobile accident, do you require that they pay the deductible? I see more and more employers are going in that direction, where if it was preventable and you were found at fault, you were ticketed by the responding officer, it's on you to pay that deductible. A lot of people have seen this, the 1-800, how's my driving and all that. And sometimes you can get people that'll call in just because they feel like rather than giving you the bird because you cut them off, they're just going to call that number and call it into you. And it may be a true issue, it may not be a true issue. But how are you checking up on your employees that are representing your company? Are you going out and doing random spot checks out in the field? When I worked for a different employer in private industry, we had approximately 50 drivers that would go throughout Central Florida. And what I would do is I would randomly go to my dispatch, pull a route sheet and say, see you later, I'm going hunting. And what I meant by going hunting is I'd go out on that route and try to track down that driver and just follow them and see how they drive. I would actually go to the customer location and observe them backing into the customer location, parking, securing the vehicle. But I would do those field spot checks to make sure that when they nodded their head, yes, they understood when I did the training at the plant. When they were out in the field, they were actually following through on that training. With your telematics, they can do more than just locate your vehicles. They can tell you how often that driver is speeding. They can tell you how often they're hard braking. They can tell you lots of things about how that vehicle is being utilized. And it can save you money on wear and tear on the vehicle, but it also can help you identify, hey, you know what? We hired this guy to drive our company vehicle, and he's not as safe as we initially thought he was. Maybe we need to pull him in and do some remedial training. You can also do yard observations at the end of the day when they're coming back into your location and just observe how they do things. If you mandate that they do a pre-trip and a post-trip inspection on the vehicle, that's something to do an observation on, because we talked about observational safety, because here's how I typically saw a post-trip vehicle inspection take place. I'm the driver. All right, I pulled into the yard. All right, grab my papers. I'm back here at the dispatch desk. All right, yep. Here's my post-trip. Yet the vehicle was over there. And they would do that pencil whipping and just go through the list. Yep, I did my post-trip. So you should observe that and see, are they just going through the motions to submit the documentation? Or are they truly looking at the vehicle, kicking the tires, looking for leaking fluids, those kinds of things?
Sir, can I ask a question?
Sure.
But isn't that a violation if I do a post-trip survey and it's found I have an accident because my brakes were defective and I wrote on that post-trip that my vehicle was fine?
Yes, you could potentially be held liable. It's very possible. That's where it's important too, as well as if you have an in-house maintenance program for the vehicles, where maybe you do some of the maintenance on your own in-house, that you're making sure that there's follow-through when the drivers do identify that there's a defect with the vehicle that needs to be corrected. The maintenance isn't saying, just get out there and run the route, I'll fix it later, because you could be held liable and it could turn into a bigger issue. We had one claim with one of the companies that we insure where at their corporate office they said, yes, we do. We follow through with all the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration requirements as far as hiring practices. We check their driver's license. We get 10-year work history, all that. At the corporate location, that's what they told me. Great, they're compliant, 100% average, good. Found out when they had an incident that their satellite location in Alabama, corporate says we have to do it, but we need a driver. We need a driver, you can drive. Fast forward and find out that they did not follow the proper hiring practices, did no road test. The individual that was a driver had medical problems that would have restricted him from being a commercial driver, had an alcohol abuse problem as well. We ended up paying $6 million on that claim. And it actually was not even any damage to the vehicle that we insured. They caused another accident between two other vehicles. But $6 million later, all because that company did not have the proper hiring practices in place as far as their satellite locations. So if you've got multiple locations or out-of-state exposures, are all the facilities consistent in what your program says you're going to do? Key thing you want to do when you do identify an issue with a particular driver is not make it the blame game. You want to make sure that you're using it as a coaching opportunity, that you're telling them why it's important, not just slapping them on the hand every time you see a safety infraction when it comes to operation of the vehicle. You want to make sure that you demonstrate that you're concerned about their safety, that, hey, I'm going to kick you in the butt if I get another ticket from FHP. That's not what it's about. It's about coaching and teaching them and showing them that you care about them. So the driver management portion talks about the training aspects and the written programs and procedures. Do you need to have a driver incentive program? That's a big thing right now with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. They've got the Compliance, Safety, and Accountability Program for certified drivers. And they're kicking that idea around now is if we go X number of miles without an incident, do we get recognized as a safe fleet operator or safe motor carrier? How do we go about doing that without showing a conflict of interest where a regulatory organization might think that we're underreporting so that we get that incentive or that award? And really, just like we measure any other aspect of an employee's performance, are we measuring their performance when it comes to operating of our company vehicles? Have you provided the right vehicles? Have you provided the right equipment? Are you expecting your drivers to make do with equipment that's below average or subpar? How often are the vehicles being inspected and maintained? Are you doing the minimum requirements? Or are you going above and beyond? Anybody in here have an in-house maintenance program as far as your vehicles? Quite a few. Everything's documented? Because like we said earlier in an earlier presentation, if it's not on paper, it didn't happen. So you want to make sure that not only are you inspecting the vehicles, that you're documenting it, that when you do identify a deficiency, that something is being done to correct it as soon as possible. Do you have a need for a fleet manager? Because even when you start out small with just maybe 12 vehicles, but suddenly you hit that growth curve, you want to make sure at some point you don't get behind that growth curve. And if you suddenly go from 12 vehicles to a fleet of 200, I would hope that you have someone that's dedicated just to managing that fleet and ensuring that you have the proper fleet, that it's properly maintained. So those are some of the questions that are answered in this standard. And where I'm going with this is it gives you very basic information that you should include in your program. When it comes to accident reporting kits, I asked the question earlier if, I talked about deer in headlights and those kinds of things. And depending on who your insurance carrier is or any other organization you work with, they can provide you with simple resources. These are simple accident reporting kits that we provide to our insureds on if they get in an accident. They just pull out this simple little envelope. It's got it in English and Spanish. And it's got 2 witness statement cards. And it has a diagram for them to draw, what happened, what were the weather conditions, what were the road conditions, all that. But how do your employees know? Because they may not get in an accident. They may drive for you for 5 years and never get in an accident, and then suddenly they got a little minor fender bender. And typically, if you don't use it, you kind of lose it. You may have done the training 5 years ago when they started, but do they know what to do in the event of an accident? Maybe that's a refresher training you should do every year as part of their in-service training. Do they have a first aid kit in case they have to provide bandages or something of that nature? Is it necessary? Is it required? A lot of times I'll get DOT type questions on fire extinguishers, first aid kits, and there are some gray areas to that as well. So you need to look into that and do your research and say, what do we need to include in our program as it relates to incident reporting and analysis? Do we determine whether they're preventable or not? And do we have corrective action? Just because it happened doesn't mean there shouldn't be some corrective action to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if we've got an employee that is a habitual offender, are they more of a liability than they are an asset? And at what point do we cut them loose? I'm not getting into all the employment law issues or HR issues, but that's something that you need to think about and talk about. So what do you do? How do you go about doing this? Because I threw a lot of information out at you, but start looking at one key area at a time. Where do you think your focus needs to be? Is it on the management accountability, the management commitment piece? Is it on the driver training piece? Where do we start at? If we don't have anything, who can we go to and get something to start with at least? So, looking at your internal resources, do you have somebody that has DOT experience, or they worked at another place that had a fleet safety program that Kelly had referred to the rip-off and deploy? I call it rip-off and duplicate, but the same concept. Maybe they have some semblance of a fleet safety program from a previous employer that they can share with you. External. Y'all have an insurance carrier, correct? You've got loss control guys like me. We're a free resource available to you. I say free, you're still paying premium, but we're a free resource available to you that we can assist you with developing a fleet safety program. You have insurance agents that can assist you and provide you with some guidance and criteria on what you should do and how you should do it. But you really want to think about truly what are our operations when it comes to vehicle use. Because you don't have to have a 100-page written fleet safety program if you've only got one vehicle or two vehicles. But if you've got an extensive fleet, you want to make sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's. If you've got DOT regulated, or what I call CDL exposure, do we have driver qualification files? Do we have driver drug and alcohol files? Do we know what they are? Because a lot of times where I've gone to one trucking company as a prospect, and I asked them about driver qualification files, and they kind of gave me that deer in the headlights look. And when I explained what it was, they said, oh yeah, that's all in the personnel file. Well, if you look at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration rules and regulations, that's a no-no. You can't have that stuff in the personnel file. It's a separate file that you need to have if you have a CDL driver. So look at the resources that are available to you and how can they help you out, whether it's internal, external, free versus cost. When should you start? Now's the optimum time. You're getting a lot of information thrown at you today when it comes to incentive programs and fleet safety and all those things. But just like any safety program that you have in place currently, at a minimum, you should be looking at that fleet safety program on an annual basis to determine, has anything changed? Do we have any new exposures? Do we have any new operations? What's our performance looking like? Last year, we only had 12 accidents. Was that acceptable? And now this year, we're already at 6, and we're only 4 months, 5 months into the policy year. We're going in the wrong direction. So you need to determine, hey, how often should I be looking at the metrics and the measures that our performance is showing, and do we need to update and change our fleet safety program? An example of that, a lot of times you'll see the cable contractors with the cones on their vehicles. We ripped off and duplicated that initiative when I worked in private industry, where our drivers were backing into things a lot, backing into buildings, backing into water mains that led to operations. So we implemented a cone policy so that our driver had to put a cone in the front of the vehicle and a cone in the back of the vehicle. And that way, when they decided to back out of their parking situation, before they even started operating the vehicle, they had to remove those cones and kind of look around the vehicle to make sure they weren't going to back into anything. So those are things you need to look at. Another thing you should look at is when it comes to preventability and accident investigation. Let's say the driver says, well, I was at this facility and there was just no other place to park, so I parked here. Use resources that are available to you, like Google Earth. Google Earth is a great tool, even though it's not real time, but I had a driver tell me there was nowhere else I could park. And I said, so it happened at 123 Any Street, USA. Yeah, it happened at 123 Any Street, USA. Pulled that up on Google Earth. And I said, where were you parked at? And he'd point on the Google Earth. And I said, well, based upon that, you could have parked here, you could have parked there, you could have parked there. And so your vehicle was hit while you were inside, but you parked right on the side of a busy highway. Now, I know it doesn't seem fair to that driver, but in my opinion, that was a preventable incident. And in discussing it with that individual's peers, they came up with the same idea, that that was a preventable incident. So using the resources that are available to you can really help you to update your program, wipe the dust off. Because when anybody comes in and says, let me see your fleet safety program, the first thing you shouldn't do is pull it off the shelf and say, yep, here you go. So who can help you? Like I said, your insurance agent, your insurance carrier, and I'm not here to do a sales pitch, but I think AmeriSure is the best thing since sliced bread, but any insurance carrier has an internal loss control people. Maybe they outsource it, but you probably have a safety person or a loss control person that can assist you. Utilize them as a resource. The Alliance for Central Florida Safety. That's the whole point of that group, is to get together and help businesses, and that's why Safety Day exists. The American Society of Safety Engineers, another group that can assist you. If you have a fleet manager or a risk manager, get their take on things. Basically, we're all here in this room to help one another. So hopefully you've been networking as well and bouncing ideas off of each other. Talk to HR, talk to any regulatory agency. They're not going to bite your head off. You know, a lot of people are scared of talking to an OSHA or a DOT, but you can communicate with them. You just have to choose your words carefully. You may have to report yourself anonymously, but you can get a lot of different information from them as well. So there's lots of resources out there, and it's really a team project. It's not going to be one person say, man, that's a huge undertaking. You have to work together as a team and get input from your insurance agent or your carrier or your fleet manager, whomever it may be. Other resources that are out there, I already talked about that. So let's kind of summarize. We talked about the $16,500 average cost. 12 a year, that's $198,000. 3% profit margin, you're looking at $6.6 million in additional revenue. From a cost standpoint alone, that can impact your organization and how you do business. When you look at the people and the medical care and the legal expenses are only going up. The medical costs are only going up. And you may have workers' compensation claims against that motor vehicle accident as well. So when an injury occurs, the typical cost to an employer is $74,000. So that $6.6 million in additional revenue just grew even more if you have injuries. And if you have a company vehicle, you've got the company name plastered on the side of the truck. I lovingly refer to that as you're an ATM on wheels. Because if there is a person that wants to take advantage of the system and they want to be the next billboard with the big check, the first thing they're going to ask is, what are your limits of coverage? And if it's $5 million, guess what they want from you, because they got Dewey, Scrum, and Howe as their attorney? They want $5 million. It's something that's bleeding employers figuratively and literally. It's a problem that's only getting worse, and you need to take control of it. So as an employer, regardless of whether you're HR, whether or not you're a company owner, safety person, whatever your job title may be, you obviously came here for a reason because you are concerned about safety. You need to take the bull by the horns and look at this and not just say, well, stuff happens. We've got 200 vehicles on the road. We're going to have accidents. You shouldn't just say stuff happens. And then really you need to look at, have we got all of our checks and balances in place to minimize our risk as much as possible? You're never going to have zero risk. You're never going to have zero harm. But if you can minimize your risk as much as possible through your written policies and procedures, through your corrective actions, you're going to ultimately make it a better workplace, a safer workplace. So what do you need to do next after leaving here besides fighting traffic? Maybe you should demonstrate good driving skills, number one, is what I would say. But when you do get back to your office, take a breath and say, you know what, a lot of information got thrown at me today. What's important to my organization? Where do I need to focus? If I want to update my fleet safety program, who should I get with as far as getting resources? What do I need to do? Or do I need to set the baseline first and figure out where we're at right now and where do I want to go? And then from there, don't rest on your laurels. Just because you update your program once, go back to that annual review and determine, hey, has anything changed? Is there anything different? Is there something maybe that we need to take away from our program that we had included before? Any questions? I don't know how I did on time here, but I know some of us went over. Look at that, right on time. Any questions at all? If not, thank you all for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.